August 6, 1945. A young Japanese engineer stood in a shipyard in Hiroshima, preparing to return home after a business trip. The war was nearly over. He was thinking about his wife, his baby son, the train he would take that afternoon. Then the sky exploded. A flash brighter than the sun swallowed the city. The blast threw him through the air. His skin burned. His ears burst. Buildings vanished. Thousands died in seconds. Yet somehow, he survived. Most people would call that a miracle. But what happened next is what turned Tsutomu Yamaguchi into one of the most extraordinary survivors in human history. Because 3 days later, he walked into another city, another morning, another office, and another atomic bomb. This is the unbelievable true story of the man who survived both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. History is filled with soldiers, leaders, heroes, and villains. But sometimes the most remarkable stories belong to ordinary people who never wanted to become part of history at all. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was one of those people. He was not a politician. He was not a military commander. He was not searching for glory. He was simply an engineer trying to return home to his family during the final days of World War II. Yet fate placed him at the exact center of the two most devastating explosions ever used in war. For decades, many people believed his story was too unbelievable to be true. How could one man survive Hiroshima and Nagasaki? How could someone escape death not once, but twice? Yet documents, witnesses, medical records, and government recognition would eventually confirm every detail. His life became proof that even in humanity's darkest moments, survival can be stronger than destruction. To understand how this happened, we must return to Japan in the summer of 1945. A nation exhausted by war. A young engineer far from home. And a morning that would change the world forever. In the summer of 1945, Japan was collapsing under the weight of a war it could no longer win. Cities had already been devastated by conventional bombing campaigns. Supplies were scarce. Families lived with constant fear. Every day brought new rumors, new losses, and new uncertainty about the future. 29-year-old Tsutomu Yamaguchi worked as an engineer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. His job involved designing and inspecting oil tankers that were essential to Japan's wartime operations. Like millions of other civilians, he was not fighting on the front lines, but the war affected every aspect of his life. Long hours, shortages, and constant anxiety had become normal. Despite the chaos surrounding the country, Yamaguchi's thoughts often remained focused on his family. Back home in Nagasaki, his wife Hisako was caring for their infant son. Every trip away from home felt dangerous. Transportation was unreliable. Air raids could happen without warning. Yet work still had to be done. In early August 1945, Yamaguchi and two co-workers were finishing a business assignment in Hiroshima. The city had largely escaped the massive firebombing that had destroyed many other Japanese cities. Because of that, Hiroshima still looked relatively intact compared to much of the country. The assignment was ending. The men were preparing to leave and return home. After weeks away, Yamaguchi was eager to see his wife and child again. He packed his belongings and looked forward to boarding a train that would finally take him back to Nagasaki. On the evening of August 5, he went to sleep believing the next day would be ordinary. He had no way of knowing that he was about to witness something no human being had ever experienced before. The following morning, August 6, 1945, dawned clear and bright. At approximately 8 o'clock, Yamaguchi was walking through the city on his way to finish final paperwork before departing. Then he realized something terrifying. He had forgotten an important document. A simple mistake. An ordinary inconvenience. So he turned around. That small decision would place him directly beneath one of the most catastrophic events in human history. At 8:15 a.m., he looked up toward the sky and saw a plane. At 8:15 in the morning, Hiroshima disappeared inside a light no one on Earth had ever seen before. Tsutomu Yamaguchi looked up and noticed something falling from the sky. For one brief second, it may have looked harmless, distant, almost unreal. Then came the flash. A white light stronger than the sun filled everything around him. There was no time to understand it. No time to run. No time to pray. The light hit first, and in that instant, the world he knew ended. The heat struck his body like fire from heaven. His face and arms burned. The force of the explosion lifted him from the ground and threw him through the air. 1 second he was walking through Hiroshima as an engineer trying to return home. The next second he was lying injured, half-conscious, surrounded by dust, smoke, and silence so strange it felt like the city itself had stopped breathing. When he opened his eyes, he could not understand what had happened. The sky had changed. The streets had changed. Buildings that had stood moments earlier were broken, burning, or gone. People moved through the ruins like shadows. Some cried out for help. Others walked without direction, unable to believe what their eyes were seeing. Hiroshima had not simply been bombed. It had been transformed into a place that no longer looked human. Yamaguchi was badly injured, but alive. His skin was burned. His hearing was damaged. His body was in shock. Every movement hurt. But somewhere inside him, one thought remained stronger than the pain: he had to survive. He had to find his co-workers. He had to get back to Nagasaki. He had to return to his wife and his baby son. As the smoke rose over Hiroshima, Yamaguchi did not yet know the name of the weapon that had hit the city. He did not know that the world would soon call it an atomic bomb. He only knew that something impossible had happened, and somehow, against every rule of fate, he was still breathing. And that should have been the end of his nightmare. But it was only the beginning. For several minutes after the explosion, Tsutomu Yamaguchi struggled to understand whether he was alive or dead. Everything around him felt unreal. The familiar streets of Hiroshima had vanished beneath smoke, fire, and destruction. Landmarks he had passed every day during his business trip were gone. Buildings had collapsed into piles of shattered wood and twisted metal. Windows no longer existed. Roofs had disappeared. Entire neighborhoods seemed to have been erased from existence. The air itself felt different. It carried dust, ash, and the smell of burning that stretched farther than the eye could see. Yamaguchi forced himself to stand. Pain shot through his body. The burns on his skin throbbed with every movement. His ears rang continuously, making it difficult to hear anything clearly. But he knew he could not remain where he was. The city was burning, and staying still meant risking death. As he began walking, the full horror of the situation revealed itself. People emerged from the smoke looking less like survivors and more like ghosts. Many were severely burned. Their clothes had been torn away by the blast. Some wandered aimlessly, unable to comprehend what had happened. Others called for family members who would never answer. Some simply sat among the ruins in complete silence, staring into nothing. The scene was unlike anything Yamaguchi had ever imagined possible. This was not a battlefield. This was not an ordinary bombing raid. Entire sections of the city had been destroyed in a single moment. Everywhere he looked, there were signs of lives interrupted without warning. Bicycles abandoned in the streets. Lunchboxes lying in the rubble. Personal belongings scattered among collapsed homes. The normal rhythm of life had been frozen at the exact second the bomb exploded. As the hours passed, Yamaguchi searched desperately for his two co-workers. In a city that no longer resembled itself, finding anyone seemed impossible. Yet somehow, against all odds, he found them. Both men had survived. They were injured, exhausted, and shocked, but alive. The three stood together among the ruins, struggling to process the fact that they had escaped an event that had killed tens of thousands around them. None of them knew it yet, but they had witnessed the first use of an atomic weapon in human history. As darkness approached, a new problem emerged. There was nowhere safe to go. The city continued to burn. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Transportation systems were damaged. Communication had collapsed. Nobody understood the true scale of what had happened. That night, Hiroshima became a city of fire. And Tsutomu Yamaguchi spent the hours wondering whether he would survive until morning. But deep inside, one thought refused to leave him. His wife. His son. Nagasaki. No matter how badly he was hurt, he had to find a way home. What he could not know was that fate was preparing something even more unbelievable. The next step in his journey would place him directly in the path of history once again. The morning after the explosion, Hiroshima looked even worse. With daylight came clarity, and clarity brought horror. What had seemed impossible during the confusion of the previous day now stood fully exposed. Entire districts had been flattened. Fires still burned in many areas. Smoke drifted across the city like a dark blanket. Thousands of people wandered through the devastation searching for loved ones, food, water, or simply answers. Tsutomu Yamaguchi could barely move without pain. The burns on his upper body had worsened overnight. His face was swollen. His hearing remained damaged. Every step felt like a struggle. Under normal circumstances, no one would have expected a man in his condition to travel anywhere. Yet Yamaguchi was determined. His family was waiting in Nagasaki. If there was any way to reach them, he would find it. Together with his co-workers, he made his way toward transportation routes that were somehow still functioning despite the catastrophe. The fact that trains were operating at all seemed almost miraculous. Japan's infrastructure had been battered by years of war, and Hiroshima had just suffered an unimaginable disaster. But the railway system was still moving people. Slowly. Unreliably. Yet moving. As Yamaguchi boarded the train, he looked around at the other passengers. Many were injured. Many carried visible burns. Others sat in complete silence, staring through the windows without expression. No one knew exactly what had happened. Rumors spread through the train cars. Some said a new type of bomb had been used. Others believed the Americans had unleashed a secret weapon. Many simply could not find words large enough to describe what they had witnessed. How could they? Human language had never been designed to explain the destruction of an entire city in a single flash. The journey was long and exhausting. Every vibration of the train sent pain through Yamaguchi's injured body. Yet he endured it. Hour after hour. Station after station. Driven by the hope of seeing his family again. Finally, he arrived in Nagasaki. Home. Against every expectation, he had survived Hiroshima. When he reached his house and reunited with his wife Hisako, the relief was overwhelming. She was shocked by his appearance. The burns. The bandages. The exhaustion in his eyes. He told her what had happened. Or at least he tried. Even as he spoke, the story sounded unbelievable. A single bomb. One airplane. An entire city destroyed. Hisako listened, but like many people hearing the story for the first time, she struggled to imagine what such a weapon could actually do. The scale was simply too enormous. Too unprecedented. Too terrifying. Yet Yamaguchi had seen it with his own eyes. And he knew the nightmare was real. The next day, despite his injuries, duty called. Japan was still at war. Work continued. Life continued. And so, on the morning of August 9, 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi reported to work at the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki. His body was burned. His ears still rang. His memories of Hiroshima were fresh and terrifying. He began explaining to his supervisor how a single bomb had destroyed an entire city. The supervisor found the story difficult to believe. One bomb destroying Hiroshima? Impossible. No weapon could do such a thing. Yamaguchi insisted he was telling the truth. He had been there. He had seen it. Then, at approximately 11:02 in the morning, a blinding light suddenly filled the room. And for the second time in 3 days, the sky exploded. At first, Tsutomu Yamaguchi thought he was reliving a nightmare. The flash was unmistakable. That terrible white light. That impossible brightness. That feeling that the sun itself had descended to earth. For a fraction of a second, his mind refused to accept what his eyes were seeing. No one could be that unlucky. No one could survive such a catastrophe and then find themselves facing the same horror again just 3 days later. But reality did not care what seemed impossible. The light filled the office. Then came the blast. Windows shattered instantly. The building shook violently. The force of the explosion rolled through the city with devastating power. People were thrown to the ground. Walls cracked. Debris flew through the air. For the second time in less than a week, Tsutomu Yamaguchi found himself at the center of an atomic explosion. The bomb that fell on Nagasaki was different from the one used on Hiroshima, but its destructive power was equally terrifying. A massive mushroom cloud began rising above the city, carrying dust, smoke, and radioactive debris thousands of feet into the sky. Inside the office, chaos erupted. Workers screamed. Some ran. Others froze. Many had no idea what was happening. But Yamaguchi knew. The moment he saw that flash, he understood. The nightmare had returned. The weapon he had described only moments earlier was now destroying his hometown. The irony was almost beyond belief. Just minutes before the explosion, he had been trying to convince others that a single bomb could destroy an entire city. Some had doubted him. Some had struggled to imagine such a weapon existed. Now nobody doubted anymore. Nagasaki itself had become the proof. Despite his injuries from Hiroshima, Yamaguchi somehow survived the second blast as well. His location inside the building and the surrounding terrain helped shield him from the worst effects. Once again, fate seemed to place a small barrier between him and death. But survival brought a new terror. His family was somewhere inside the city. His wife. His infant son. He had no idea whether they were alive. As smoke and dust filled the air, panic began growing inside him. The physical pain from his burns suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the fear gripping his heart. The destruction around him was horrifying. Yet all he could think about was reaching home. Every terrible possibility raced through his mind. What if the bomb had struck near their house? What if the blast had killed them instantly? What if they were trapped beneath rubble? What if he had survived twice only to lose the people he loved most? The city descended into confusion. Communication collapsed. Roads became difficult to navigate. Thousands searched desperately for family members. And among them was Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a man who had now witnessed 2 atomic bombings with his own eyes. A man who should not have been alive. A man desperately trying to discover whether his family still was. As he began making his way through the damaged city, he prepared himself for the worst. Because after seeing what happened in Hiroshima, he knew exactly what an atomic bomb could do. And he feared that this time, survival might not be enough. The streets of Nagasaki were filled with confusion, fear, and smoke. Everywhere Tsutomu Yamaguchi looked, people were running in different directions. Some searched for relatives. Others searched for medical help. Many simply wandered without purpose, stunned by what had happened only moments earlier. For Yamaguchi, there was only one destination. Home. Nothing else mattered. Not his burns. Not his exhaustion. Not the shock of surviving a second atomic explosion. His wife and son were somewhere in the city, and until he found them, he would know no peace. As he moved through the damaged streets, memories of Hiroshima flooded back into his mind. The scenes were painfully familiar. Collapsed buildings. Broken glass. Fires spreading through neighborhoods. Injured civilians calling out for help. 3 days earlier, he had watched one city die. Now he was watching another. The realization felt unbearable. How could the same nightmare happen twice? How could humanity create a weapon capable of such destruction? Questions filled his mind, but there were no answers waiting for him in the smoke. Only uncertainty. Only fear. The closer he came to his neighborhood, the harder it became to control his thoughts. Every destroyed building increased his anxiety. Every damaged home felt like a warning. He imagined arriving to find nothing. No house. No family. No future. By then, he had already witnessed enough tragedy to know that such outcomes were entirely possible. Thousands of families were experiencing exactly that. Entire lives erased in seconds. The closer he got, the faster his heart pounded. Then something unexpected happened. He saw familiar landmarks. Damaged, but still standing. The destruction in Nagasaki was immense, yet the city's geography had reduced some of the blast's impact in certain areas. Hills and valleys had partially shielded neighborhoods that might otherwise have been completely destroyed. Hope returned. Small at first. Then stronger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached home. For a moment, he could barely bring himself to look. Fear held him frozen. Then he saw movement. His wife was alive. His son was alive. Relief crashed over him with such force that he nearly collapsed. Against every expectation, his family had survived. The reunion was emotional beyond words. Hisako had spent hours wondering whether her husband was alive. Only days earlier, she had seen him return from Hiroshima badly injured. Now another atomic bomb had struck Nagasaki. The odds seemed impossible. Yet somehow, the family was together. Still alive. Still breathing. Still holding on to one another while the world around them seemed to be falling apart. In later years, Yamaguchi would recall how extraordinary that survival truly was. His wife had even left home shortly before the explosion to search for medicine for his burns from Hiroshima. That decision may have helped save her life. A different route. A different delay. A different moment. Tiny choices that separated survival from tragedy. As night fell over Nagasaki, the family remained together. But the danger was not over. They had survived the blast itself. What nobody fully understood at the time was the invisible threat that remained. Radiation. An enemy that could not be seen. Could not be smelled. Could not be escaped. And in the days ahead, it would leave millions asking the same terrifying question. Had surviving the bombs only delayed death? In the days following the bombing of Nagasaki, survival brought no sense of safety. The explosions were over. The mushroom clouds had faded. The fires gradually burned out. Yet a new danger remained, one that nobody fully understood. Unlike shattered buildings or raging flames, this threat could not be seen. It could not be heard. It could not be touched. And because of that, it frightened people even more. Radiation. At the time, very few civilians understood what exposure to radiation could do to the human body. Even many doctors struggled to explain the strange symptoms appearing among survivors. People who had escaped the explosions with relatively minor injuries suddenly became sick days later. Hair began falling out. Fevers appeared without warning. Extreme weakness spread through entire communities. Some survivors developed bleeding that doctors could not explain. Others died despite showing no obvious wounds. Fear spread quickly. Rumors spread even faster. Some believed the bombs had poisoned the air. Others thought the water itself had become deadly. Many wondered whether anyone exposed to the explosions could survive long-term at all. For Tsutomu Yamaguchi, these fears felt deeply personal. He had not been exposed once. He had been exposed twice. If anyone had reason to fear radiation sickness, it was him. His body was already weakened from burns and injuries. He suffered from fever and exhaustion. Some days, simply getting out of bed felt like an enormous challenge. His family worried constantly about his condition. No one knew what the future would bring. Doctors could offer little certainty. The atomic age had arrived without warning, and humanity was learning about its consequences in the most painful way imaginable. Yet despite everything, Yamaguchi refused to surrender. He focused on recovery. He focused on his family. He focused on surviving one day at a time. There was no grand plan. No heroic speech. No dramatic declaration. Just the quiet determination of a man who had already escaped death twice and was not ready to stop fighting. Across Japan, the situation continued to deteriorate. The country had been exhausted by years of war. Food shortages were severe. Cities lay in ruins. Millions of people had lost homes, loved ones, or both. Then came news that changed everything. News that many Japanese citizens never thought they would hear. The war was ending. On August 15, 1945, 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation. For the first time in history, ordinary Japanese citizens heard the voice of their emperor broadcast over the radio. The announcement was difficult to understand at first. The language was formal and unfamiliar. But the meaning soon became clear. Japan had surrendered. World War II was over. For many people, the moment brought relief. For others, sorrow. For countless families, both emotions existed together. Tsutomu Yamaguchi listened like everyone else. The war that had nearly taken his life was finished. Yet the scars it left behind would remain forever. The bombs had ended the conflict. But for survivors like Yamaguchi, a new battle was only beginning. The battle of remembering. The battle of healing. And the challenge of building a future after witnessing things no human being was ever meant to see. Years would pass. Japan would rebuild. Cities would rise again. But the memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would never disappear. And neither would the burden carried by the man who survived both. When the war ended, Japan faced one of the greatest reconstruction efforts in human history. Entire cities had been destroyed. Millions of people were homeless. Food was scarce. Jobs were uncertain. Families mourned loved ones who would never return. For survivors like Tsutomu Yamaguchi, simply returning to normal life was impossible. There was no normal life left to return to. The world that had existed before August 1945 was gone. In its place stood a country trying to rebuild itself from ruins. Yamaguchi continued working for Mitsubishi after the war. Like many Japanese citizens, he focused on supporting his family and helping create stability in an uncertain future. Every day brought challenges. The economy struggled. Resources remained limited. The memories of the bombings lingered everywhere. Yet life moved forward. His son grew. His family remained together. Years passed. Then decades. At first glance, Yamaguchi appeared to be an ordinary man living an ordinary life. But inside him lived memories that never truly faded. Certain sounds could trigger recollections of the explosions. Bright flashes could bring back images of Hiroshima. News about nuclear weapons stirred emotions that were difficult to describe. Many survivors carried similar burdens. Today we might call it trauma. At the time, few people spoke openly about such things. Instead, they carried the memories quietly. Often alone. Yamaguchi was no exception. For many years, he rarely spoke publicly about his experiences. Part of the reason was simple: many people found the story difficult to believe. Surviving Hiroshima was already extraordinary. Surviving Hiroshima and Nagasaki sounded almost impossible. Some listeners assumed details had been exaggerated. Others believed there must be some misunderstanding. Even when they accepted the facts, many struggled to comprehend what such experiences must have felt like. How do you explain witnessing 2 atomic bombings? How do you describe seeing entire cities disappear? How do you communicate the terror of realizing that the same nightmare has found you twice? There are some experiences that seem too large for language itself. As the decades passed, Japan transformed dramatically. Modern buildings replaced ruins. Technology advanced. The nation became one of the world's leading economies. Young generations grew up without direct memories of the war. For many people born after 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became historical events rather than personal experiences. Yamaguchi understood this change. He watched the world move further away from the reality he had lived through. And with every passing year, he became increasingly aware of something important. The survivors were growing older. One day, they would all be gone. When that happened, who would tell the story? Who would remind future generations what nuclear war actually looked like? Who would speak for the thousands who never had the chance? These questions slowly began changing Yamaguchi's perspective. The quiet survivor who had spent years avoiding attention would eventually decide to speak. And when he finally did, the world listened. Because his story was not simply about survival. It was about warning humanity. A warning written in fire, loss, and unimaginable destruction. And it would eventually make him one of the most important voices in the global conversation about nuclear weapons. For decades, Tsutomu Yamaguchi lived with a story that sounded almost impossible. Whenever people heard it for the first time, the reaction was usually the same. They stared. They questioned. They asked him to repeat it. Because surviving one atomic bomb already seemed miraculous. Surviving two sounded like fiction. Yet every detail was true. The records existed. The witnesses existed. The scars existed. And the memories remained painfully clear. As the years passed, journalists, historians, and researchers became increasingly interested in the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Their testimonies offered a rare glimpse into one of the most significant moments in human history. Many survivors shared stories of loss, stories of suffering, stories of rebuilding. But Yamaguchi's experience stood apart from almost all the others. His story connected both bombings, both cities, both tragedies. Few people in history had witnessed even one atomic explosion. He had witnessed two. At first, official recognition of his unique experience was complicated. Japan had systems for documenting survivors of the atomic bombings, known as hibakusha, but proving exposure to both attacks required extensive verification. Documents had to be reviewed. Records had to be checked. Testimonies had to be confirmed. Years passed before authorities fully recognized the extraordinary nature of his experience. Meanwhile, Yamaguchi became increasingly willing to discuss what he had seen. Not because he wanted fame. Not because he wanted sympathy. But because he feared that memory itself was fading. The world was entering a new era. The Cold War had created massive nuclear arsenals. Countries possessed weapons far more powerful than those used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Millions of people discussed nuclear strategy, military balance, political power. But Yamaguchi believed many of them had forgotten the human cost. They talked about bombs. He remembered people. They talked about numbers. He remembered faces. They discussed military objectives. He remembered children, families, homes, lives that vanished in a flash of light. As he spoke publicly, audiences often fell silent. Not because his words were dramatic. In fact, they were usually simple. What gave them power was the fact that he had been there. He was not describing theory. He was describing reality. He had walked through Hiroshima after the first bomb. He had watched Nagasaki suffer the same fate 3 days later. He carried evidence of those events on his body and in his memory. And because of that, his message carried a weight few people could match. By the early 2000s, Yamaguchi had become one of the most recognizable voices among atomic bomb survivors. Yet one remarkable chapter of his story was still waiting to happen. A chapter that would finally bring official recognition to something many believed could never happen. The recognition of a man who had survived both atomic bombings. A distinction so rare that history itself struggled to comprehend it. For most of his life, Tsutomu Yamaguchi never asked to become famous. He never sought attention. He never tried to build a reputation around his suffering. In fact, for many years, he preferred to live quietly with his family and focus on the future rather than the past. But history had other plans. As researchers continued documenting the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Yamaguchi's case attracted increasing attention. The evidence supporting his story became overwhelming. His business trip to Hiroshima was documented. His injuries were documented. His return to Nagasaki was documented. His presence during the second bombing was documented. The facts aligned with remarkable precision. What once sounded impossible was now supported by records and testimony. Eventually, Japanese authorities formally acknowledged what few human beings could ever claim. Tsutomu Yamaguchi had survived both atomic bombings. The recognition carried enormous symbolic importance. It was not simply about one man. It was about preserving historical truth. It was about ensuring that future generations understood what had happened during those days in August 1945. And it was about honoring the experiences of those who had lived through humanity's first nuclear attacks. News organizations around the world reported the story. People from different countries reacted with disbelief. Many had never heard of Yamaguchi before. Others knew the history of Hiroshima and Nagasaki but had no idea that someone had survived both events. The story spread because it touched something universal. Human beings are drawn to stories of survival, especially when survival seems impossible. But Yamaguchi always tried to redirect attention away from himself. Whenever reporters focused on his extraordinary luck, he often reminded them of those who were less fortunate. For every survivor, there were countless victims. For every story like his, there were thousands of stories that ended on August 6 or August 9. He understood this better than anyone. He had walked through the aftermath. He had seen the devastation with his own eyes. He knew that his survival was the exception, not the rule. That perspective gave his words unusual power. Unlike politicians, he had no agenda. Unlike military leaders, he had no strategy to defend. Unlike historians, he was not speaking from books. He spoke as a witness. A witness who had stood beneath 2 nuclear explosions and lived. As the world entered the 21st century, nuclear weapons still existed. Many nations still possessed them. Some possessed enough to destroy civilization many times over. That reality troubled Yamaguchi deeply. He often wondered whether humanity had truly learned the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Had people understood the warning? Or had they simply moved on? The older he became, the more urgent those questions felt. Because time was running out. The generation that had experienced the bombings firsthand was disappearing. Soon, there would be no witnesses left. And when the witnesses were gone, only memory would remain. That is why Yamaguchi decided that his final years would be devoted to something larger than himself. Not survival. Not recognition. But a mission. A mission to make sure the world never forgot what nuclear war actually looks like. As Tsutomu Yamaguchi grew older, he became increasingly aware that he was living on borrowed time. Not simply because of age, but because he belonged to a generation that was slowly disappearing. The men and women who had witnessed Hiroshima and Nagasaki firsthand were becoming fewer every year. One by one, their voices were falling silent. Yamaguchi understood that when the last survivor was gone, the world would no longer be able to ask questions directly. Future generations would know the bombings only through photographs, books, documentaries, and historical records. That realization gave him a profound sense of responsibility. He believed that memory alone was not enough. People needed to understand. They needed to feel the human reality behind the history. For this reason, he began speaking more openly about his experiences. He participated in interviews. He shared his testimony with journalists. He spoke to students. He met with groups interested in peace and nuclear disarmament. Every time he told the story, he hoped someone would listen carefully. Not because he wanted sympathy, but because he wanted understanding. Many people expected anger from him. After all, he had suffered through horrors that few could imagine. Yet those who met him were often surprised. His message was not built on hatred. It was built on warning. He understood that hatred rarely prevents future violence. Understanding does. Yamaguchi often described the bombings in simple human terms. He spoke about ordinary people. Workers heading to their jobs. Children going to school. Families preparing meals. Lives unfolding normally one moment and ending the next. Those details mattered to him. Because nuclear weapons are often discussed in abstract language. Governments talk about deterrence. Military experts discuss strategy. Politicians debate security. But Yamaguchi wanted people to remember the individuals hidden behind those discussions. The mothers. The fathers. The grandparents. The children. The thousands of lives forever changed in a single morning. As his testimony reached wider audiences, many listeners found themselves deeply moved. Not because he exaggerated. In fact, he rarely did. The truth itself was powerful enough. The image of one man surviving Hiroshima and then experiencing Nagasaki 3 days later seemed almost beyond belief. Yet he carried that reality every day of his life. His scars reminded him. His memories reminded him. History reminded him. And so he continued speaking. Year after year. Even as his health gradually declined. Even as age made travel more difficult. Even as the memories remained painful. Because he believed silence was more dangerous. If the world forgot what happened in 1945, it might become easier to repeat the same mistakes. That possibility frightened him far more than telling his story ever did. And so, long after the explosions themselves had faded into history, Tsutomu Yamaguchi continued fighting. Not against a nation. Not against an enemy. But against forgetting. Against indifference. Against the belief that such tragedies could never happen again. Because he knew better than anyone that history can repeat itself when people stop paying attention. By the early 2000s, Tsutomu Yamaguchi had become something he never expected to be. A symbol. Not a symbol of war. Not a symbol of politics. But a symbol of survival. Around the world, people learned his name and discovered the extraordinary path his life had taken through history. Many viewed him as living proof of the resilience of the human spirit. Others saw him as a reminder of the unimaginable consequences of nuclear warfare. To Yamaguchi, however, he remained what he had always been. A husband. A father. A grandfather. A man who had simply tried to live his life after experiencing events that should have killed him. As he entered his later years, his health naturally began to decline. Decades had passed since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but age eventually catches everyone. The body becomes slower. Energy fades. Simple tasks become more difficult. Yet even as his strength diminished, his commitment to sharing his story remained. He understood something many people do not realize until late in life. Time is limited. Every survivor eventually becomes a memory. Every witness eventually becomes history. And every generation must decide what lessons it chooses to carry forward. Yamaguchi spent many of his final years reflecting on those lessons. He often spoke about peace. About responsibility. About the importance of remembering. His message was remarkably consistent. The suffering caused by nuclear weapons should never be repeated. That was not a political statement for him. It was a human one. He had seen too much to believe otherwise. He had walked through cities transformed into ruins. He had seen families torn apart in seconds. He had witnessed destruction on a scale that words could barely describe. And he knew that modern nuclear weapons possessed far greater power than those used in 1945. That knowledge stayed with him. As his story spread internationally, countless people wrote about him, interviewed him, and shared his experiences with new audiences. Teachers discussed him in classrooms. Historians referenced his testimony. Documentary filmmakers explored his life. His story crossed borders, languages, and generations. The man who once struggled to convince people that a single bomb had destroyed Hiroshima had become one of the most recognized witnesses of the atomic age. In January 2010, at the age of 93, Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away. His death marked the end of an extraordinary journey. A journey that had begun as a simple business trip. A journey that had carried him through 2 atomic bombings. A journey that had transformed him from an ordinary engineer into one of history's most remarkable survivors. News of his passing spread across Japan and beyond. Many people reflected on the incredible odds he had overcome. Others reflected on the warnings he spent decades sharing. But perhaps the most important part of his legacy was not the fact that he survived. It was what he chose to do after surviving. Because surviving tragedy is one thing. Using that survival to help others understand the value of peace is something far rarer. And that was the legacy Tsutomu Yamaguchi left behind. A legacy that continues long after his voice has fallen silent. Human beings are fascinated by probability. We love stories about impossible coincidences. Lottery winners. Miraculous escapes. Moments when fate seems to bend the rules. And few stories in modern history appear more improbable than the life of Tsutomu Yamaguchi. Even today, people hear his story and ask the same question. What were the chances? What were the chances that a man would be in Hiroshima on the exact morning the first atomic bomb exploded? What were the chances he would survive? What were the chances he could physically leave the devastated city despite his injuries? What were the chances he would return to Nagasaki just before the second atomic bomb arrived? And what were the chances he would survive again? The chain of events seems almost impossible to comprehend. Yet history is often shaped by moments that appear impossible in hindsight. A forgotten document caused Yamaguchi to turn around on the morning of August 6. Had he continued walking in a different direction, the outcome might have been different. Had the train lines failed completely, he might never have returned to Nagasaki. Had he arrived home later, he might have been somewhere else when the second bomb exploded. Tiny decisions. Tiny delays. Tiny moments. Each one influencing everything that followed. Looking back, it is tempting to see destiny in those events. Many people do. Others see coincidence. Others see luck. History cannot answer which interpretation is correct. What history can confirm is that Yamaguchi lived through circumstances so extraordinary that they continue to amaze people decades later. Yet focusing only on the improbability of his survival risks missing the deeper lesson. The truly remarkable part of his story is not that he survived twice. It is that he remained human afterward. Many people would have become consumed by bitterness. Many would have withdrawn from the world. Many would have spent the rest of their lives defined entirely by those traumatic days. Yamaguchi chose a different path. He built a family. He worked. He raised children. He participated in society. And eventually, he transformed his painful memories into a message that could help others. That choice may be even more extraordinary than survival itself. Because surviving an event often depends on circumstances beyond our control. But deciding how to live afterward is something else entirely. That decision belongs to us. Yamaguchi understood this. He knew that while he could not change what happened in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, he could choose how those experiences shaped the rest of his life. And he chose purpose over despair. Understanding over hatred. Memory over silence. Those choices became the foundation of his legacy. A legacy that reaches far beyond the atomic bombings themselves. A legacy about resilience. About perspective. And about the remarkable strength hidden within ordinary people. Because before history remembered him as the man who survived 2 atomic bombs, he was simply a husband trying to get home to his family. And perhaps that is what makes his story so powerful. He was never seeking greatness. Yet greatness found him anyway. As the decades passed, People often asked Tsutomu Yamaguchi what he had learned from surviving both atomic bombings. It seemed like a reasonable question. After all, if anyone had gained unique insight into war, suffering, and survival, it was him. Yet the answers he gave were often simpler than people expected. He did not speak in complicated theories. He did not present himself as a philosopher. He did not claim to possess special wisdom. Instead, he spoke about human life, its fragility, its value, and how quickly it can disappear. That lesson had been burned into his memory on August 6 and August 9, 1945. One moment, people were living ordinary lives. The next, everything was gone. A worker heading to his job. A mother preparing breakfast. A child walking to school. The bomb did not care who they were. It did not care what dreams they carried. It did not care what plans they had for tomorrow. The destruction was indiscriminate. And that reality deeply shaped Yamaguchi's view of the world. He came to believe that every human life possesses a value that is easy to forget during times of conflict. Wars are often discussed through maps, numbers, and political decisions. But Yamaguchi had seen the human side. He knew that behind every statistic stood real people. People with families. People with fears. People with hopes. People who wanted to live. This perspective influenced nearly everything he said in his later years. Whenever he spoke about nuclear weapons, he rarely focused on military strategy. Instead, he focused on consequences. The burned cities. The broken families. The generations affected long after the explosions ended. He wanted people to understand that the true cost of war cannot always be measured immediately. Some wounds remain for decades. Some losses echo through entire generations. And some memories never fully disappear. Perhaps that is why his testimony remains so powerful. It was not built on ideology. It was built on experience. No one could argue with what he had seen. No one could tell him that the suffering was exaggerated. He had walked through it. He had survived it. And he had spent the rest of his life carrying it. Yet despite everything, Yamaguchi remained remarkably hopeful about humanity. That may be one of the most surprising aspects of his story. After witnessing 2 atomic bombings, one might expect him to lose faith in people entirely. Instead, he continued believing that human beings could learn, could grow, could choose a better path. His optimism was not naive. It was hard-earned, forged through suffering, built upon survival, and strengthened by decades of reflection. He understood humanity at its worst. Yet he still believed in its potential for good. That belief became one of the most important parts of his legacy. Because if a man who witnessed Hiroshima and Nagasaki could still believe in the possibility of peace, perhaps there was hope for the rest of us as well. And that hope would become the final message he left behind. As Tsutomu Yamaguchi entered the final chapter of his life, he became increasingly concerned about one thing. Not his health. Not his reputation. Not even his remarkable place in history. He worried about memory. He worried that future generations would become so distant from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that the bombings would eventually feel like ancient history. A chapter in a textbook. A documentary on television. A date memorized for an exam and forgotten soon afterward. Yamaguchi understood how easily that could happen. Every year placed more distance between the world and August 1945. Every year removed another witness. Every year made direct memory a little weaker. And yet, he believed that forgetting carried enormous risks. Because history has a dangerous habit of repeating itself when people stop paying attention. Throughout his final years, he encouraged younger generations to study the past carefully. Not to live in fear. Not to dwell on hatred. But to understand. Understanding, he believed, was humanity's best defense against repeating its worst mistakes. His message was remarkably consistent no matter where he spoke. Schools. Interviews. Public events. Private conversations. The words changed slightly. The meaning never did. Human beings must never forget what nuclear war actually looks like. Not in theory. Not on paper. Not in political speeches. But in reality. The reality of burned cities. Destroyed families. Children searching for parents. Parents searching for children. Entire communities disappearing in moments. Those were the images he carried throughout his life. Those were the images he hoped future generations would never have to witness for themselves. Perhaps the most remarkable part of Yamaguchi's message was its lack of bitterness. He had every reason to be angry. Every reason to hate. Every reason to spend the rest of his life consumed by resentment. Yet those who listened to him often noticed something different. A quiet determination. A deep sadness. But also compassion. He understood that hatred alone could never build a better future. Only understanding could do that. Only memory. Only wisdom. Only the willingness to learn from tragedy. This perspective gave his testimony unusual power. People listened because they sensed authenticity. They sensed that he was not speaking to win an argument. He was speaking to protect future generations from suffering. And that mission continued until the very end of his life. Even as age weakened his body, his conviction remained strong. The world might change. Technology might advance. Governments might rise and fall. But the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki should never be forgotten. That was the responsibility he believed belonged to all humanity. Not just to Japan. Not just to survivors. To everyone. Because nuclear weapons do not threaten one nation alone. They threaten all nations. They threaten all people. And that truth, Yamaguchi believed, made the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki a human story rather than a national one. A story that belongs to the entire world. A story that must continue being told long after the last witness is gone. And now, as we reach the end of his remarkable journey, one final question remains. What should we remember most about the man who survived 2 atomic bombs? History often transforms people into symbols. Over time, the details of a person's life can become overshadowed by the event that made them famous. For many people, Tsutomu Yamaguchi is remembered simply as the man who survived 2 atomic bombs. And while that description is true, it tells only part of the story. Because behind the extraordinary survival was an ordinary human being. A husband who loved his wife. A father who worried about his son. A worker trying to support his family. A man who had plans for the future before history unexpectedly placed him at the center of one of its darkest chapters. That humanity is easy to overlook. When we hear incredible stories, we sometimes focus only on the dramatic moments. The explosions. The survival. The impossible odds. But life is larger than those moments. Yamaguchi spent far more years living than surviving. Far more years raising a family than escaping disaster. Far more years building than witnessing destruction. And perhaps that is what makes his story so meaningful. The bombs did not define his entire existence. They changed it forever, certainly. But they did not become the whole of who he was. He refused to allow that. Instead, he continued living. Continued working. Continued loving. Continued hoping. That choice deserves recognition. Because tragedy often attempts to reduce people to their worst experiences. Yamaguchi resisted that reduction. He carried the memories without allowing them to consume everything else. This does not mean the pain disappeared. It never did. The scars remained. The memories remained. The losses remained. But so did life. And life kept moving forward. Many survivors of great tragedies face a similar challenge. How do you honor the past without becoming trapped inside it? How do you remember without being destroyed by remembrance? How do you carry grief while continuing to live? Yamaguchi's life offers one possible answer. You continue. One day at a time. 1 year at a time. 1 generation at a time. Not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. His story demonstrates that resilience is not always dramatic. Sometimes resilience is simply waking up the next morning, returning to work, caring for family, finding reasons to keep going despite everything. The world often celebrates spectacular acts of courage. Yet some of the greatest courage is quiet, invisible, ordinary. The courage to continue living after witnessing the unimaginable. The courage to remain compassionate after experiencing suffering. The courage to believe in peace after seeing war at its worst. That was the kind of courage Tsutomu Yamaguchi displayed throughout his life. And perhaps that is the greatest miracle of all. Not that he survived twice, but that he remained human afterward. That he preserved his capacity for empathy, for understanding, for hope, even after everything he had endured. Those qualities transformed his survival story into something much larger. Something timeless. A lesson about what it means to be human in the face of catastrophe. A lesson that remains just as relevant today as it was in 1945. And it is that lesson that brings us to the final chapter of his extraordinary journey. When the atomic bombs exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, they changed the course of history forever. Governments changed. Wars ended. The nuclear age began. Entire cities were transformed. Yet history is not only shaped by events. It is shaped by the people who carry those events forward. People who remember. People who testify. People who refuse to let the truth disappear. Tsutomu Yamaguchi became one of those people. Not because he planned to. Not because he sought recognition. But because fate placed him in a position unlike almost anyone else in human history. He witnessed the beginning of the atomic age with his own eyes. Twice. And then he spent the rest of his life helping the world understand what that meant. Today, long after his death, his story continues to be told in classrooms, documentaries, books, museums, and historical archives. Students who were born generations after World War II still learn his name. Researchers still study his testimony. Historians still reference his experience. And ordinary people around the world continue to discover his story for the first time. Each new listener experiences the same reaction: disbelief, shock, amazement, and eventually, reflection. Because once the initial surprise fades, a deeper realization emerges. The story is not really about surviving 2 atomic bombs. The story is about what survival means. What responsibility means. What memory means. And what humanity chooses to do with painful lessons from the past. Yamaguchi's legacy lives on because it speaks to universal questions. How should people respond to suffering? How should societies remember tragedy? How can future generations learn from experiences they never witnessed themselves? These questions remain relevant far beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They apply to every generation, every nation, every conflict. History offers lessons, but only if people are willing to listen. That belief guided much of Yamaguchi's life. He understood that memory alone is not enough. Memory must be shared, explained, passed forward. Otherwise, it fades. And when memory fades, understanding often disappears with it. That is why his story matters today. Not because it is extraordinary, although it certainly is. Not because it is unique, although it certainly is. But because it reminds us of something fundamental. Human beings have the ability to create unimaginable destruction. Yet they also possess the ability to learn from it. To remember. To rebuild. To choose differently. Yamaguchi spent decades hoping that humanity would make that choice. The choice of understanding over ignorance. The choice of peace over destruction. The choice of remembering rather than forgetting. Whether the world fully learns those lessons remains an open question. But his voice continues to echo through history. A witness speaking across generations. A survivor speaking to people he would never meet. A reminder that even the darkest chapters of human history contain lessons worth preserving. And perhaps no lesson was more important to him than this. The value of a human life can never be measured by politics, weapons, or war. It can only be measured by the people who live it. And that truth remains just as powerful today as it was on the mornings of August 6 and August 9, 1945. Tsutomu Yamaguchi never expected to become part of history. He was simply an engineer trying to return home to his family. Yet destiny placed him in Hiroshima on the morning of the first atomic bomb. Then returned him to Nagasaki on the morning of the second. Against all odds, he survived both. But survival was only the beginning of his story. The true significance of his life came afterward. In the years he spent rebuilding. In the family he protected. In the testimony he shared. And in the warning he offered to future generations. His story reminds us that history is not only made by generals, presidents, and politicians. Sometimes history is carried forward by ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. People who survive. People who remember. People who speak. Today, Tsutomu Yamaguchi's voice is gone. But his message remains. A message born from two flashes brighter than the sun. A message carried through decades of reflection. A message that asks humanity to remember what happened when nuclear weapons were used against cities. And to ensure that such destruction is never repeated. Because the man who survived 2 atomic bombs understood something few others ever could. The greatest victory is not surviving war. The greatest victory is preventing the next one. If you enjoyed this story and want to discover more forgotten lives, unbelievable true stories, and remarkable moments from history, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next journey into the past.